Welcome to this conversation with Axel Voss, member of the European Parliament and rapporteur on the AI Act. This conversation is brought to you by the Amsterdam Law and Technology Institute and the Network Law Review. My name is Thibault Schrepel. I am an associate professor of law at the VU Amsterdam and a faculty affiliate at Stanford University Codex Center. It's August 31, 2022, and we only have a draft of the AI Act. So instead of exploring the nitty-gritty of a text that will change to some degree, we have decided to cover the AI Act's mainline, approach, philosophy, and ambition. So for example, we won't discuss today the real-time biometric identification, the meaning of real-time, whether postponing identification by 10 seconds is a way to escape the AI Act, etc. Before we start, let me state that, in my opinion, there is, of course, much to be liked in the AI Act. For example, the strong focus on regulatory sandboxes is a world first, but in this conversation, I will nonetheless highlight what I think can be disputed. So without further ado, let us get started. First question, Axel, how are you doing and how was the summer break?
Yeah, so thanks at first for your invitation and this exchange of views. And the summer break was fantastic. But after a couple of days here in Brussels, you already feel you need another break already. But here on the AI Act, I can't predict the outcome right now, so we are starting mid of September with the negotiations.
All right, good to know. So, of course, this conversation will be very interesting to watch in 1, 2, 3 years to see, how much of what we discuss will be in the final version of the text. Again, this is why we will approach the conversation in a more general way instead of discussing, the meaning of one comma here and there.
Mm-hmm.
And let me start here with the approach. I have to warn you, this is quite a long question, but I hope easy to grasp. It seems to me that the AI Act, and I'm curious, of course, to hear your opinion, could do a better job at combining what I will call the sectorial approach that the AI Act is currently taking with a more technical approach. So said differently, I think the AI Act tech neutrality when it comes to AI functioning may put European innovation at risk, mainly because of the compliance cost that it may impose on the companies. So let me explain. I think that everyone will agree that not all AI systems present the same degree of risk. If I take an example, supervised learning systems allow for the automation of tasks while controlling the result. So if you take an example for our listeners, if you train such a system to recognize cats and dogs, once the training is complete, the system can identify cats and dogs every time you submit a new picture, which means that the system is very unlikely to drift. It can get it wrong, which is not good, but that's about it. And if we go for expert systems that we'll discuss later on today, I think it's all the more true. On the contrary, the risk is much heavier when it comes to unsupervised learning system, where the machine may sort the data according to categories that are not predefined by the human behind the machine. So to come back to my example, the system could classify photos of cats and dogs according to their skin colors, their size, etc. Anything that the system may find relevant, which of course is good because it means that some classifications may be very creative and helpful, but can also be inappropriate and lead to discrimination, racism, etc. So I come to my question. Here's the proposal. I'm curious to hear what you think of it. I propose that only the companies that operate in a high-risk sector, so that's the sectorial approach, and use an AI system whose output is not predefined, such as unsupervised learning, should be subject to the strictest duties in the AI Act, which means, on the contrary, that if you do operate in a high-risk sector, but use, let's say, supervised learning or expert system, you should be subject to less constraining obligations. Again, curious to hear what you think about all that.
So, yeah, but thanks for presenting this idea. This might be, from my point of view, always an option. What we should avoid in general is that all of a sudden, because of a weak definition and a weak classification of risks, that we have all of a sudden 95% of AI systems on board. It should be the contrary, that we should focus really on the high risk AI systems. And here, this is a question where your idea might be fill the gap, that we should think about how we can approach the high risk definition. So far, it's only proposed by the Commission that if this is a kind of a critical infrastructure, so the environment of an AI algorithm, then all of a sudden this is high risk and a high risk system without probably being a real high risk for individuals also. So that's why I would say, yes, we have to differentiate more. We have to approach these in a way where we can consider the kind of environment, but we should also consider the use of the algorithm and the context of it. And then I would say if everything is coming together, then we might have an AI high-risk system. But also the idea, what you mentioned, so how I'm understanding this, how can we minimize the obligations and safeguards and probably the evaluation of risky algorithms via supervising or something like this. This is a good idea. We can think about it. I'm totally, let's say, open also for steps like this, where we can simplify the life of the companies or developers for AI systems, because we have already a long list of safeguards, of obligations. And that's why I think we should think about to mitigate the risks via supervising. Good idea. I will make a note.
It's actually the very last question I want to ask you, if we can get to it, when it comes to the practical sides for the companies. But so to be clear, as it stands, or at least the draft that we have, you would say the high risk sphere is too large, right? As it stands.
Yes.
And one of the objectives might be to narrow it down, so to better protect and also safeguard innovation, which of course is the objective we want to reach.
Yes, right. So just to bring an example, what I have heard, probably it seems a little bit like nonsense, but it might be the situation right now that also this AI system might be in as a high-risk system. So if we are thinking about a soda or Coke machine in a critical infrastructure, let's say space agency or something like this. If you're reading the definition right now, then you would say, oh yes, the AI system in the Coke machine is in a critical infrastructure and therefore a high-risk system. And this I would consider is nonsense at the end. We should take this Coke machine more than less as a Coke machine and not kind of a part of a critical infrastructure at the end. So, and this would be the way forward to differentiate more for what use you are needing the algorithms. And if this is really risky, then we can think about an AI high-risk system.
Yeah. I like this approach very much. It makes me think of complexity science, where you consider the environment. So where is the code or the AI, operating, but also the agent. So which type of functioning, and indeed sometimes, even though the environment is risky, a AI system is not so risky as it stands.
Mm-hmm.
That makes me think of, and I want to discuss this. I know this has been heavily discussed already. The fact that the AI Act, as it is, encompasses expert systems. My colleagues and I are wondering why the AI Act covers such expert systems that have been around for such a long time. And in fact, we failed to identify why today more than yesterday, we should subject expert systems to special rules when existing rules seems to do just fine for all those years. So, and should you agree, what do you think are the chances that the final version of the AI Act will exclude expert systems? Because as it stands, indeed, you mentioned that the AI Act may cover 90% of pretty much all software in Europe, and if you were to exclude expert system, this might already solve part of the issue. So, again, curious to hear what you think on that.
So from our point of view, it's we would say it's necessary to come forward with this idea how the European society should deal with the algorithms in the future. So what is our aspect in it? And also the second idea is also how we can harmonize the treatment of algorithms throughout the EU. So therefore, from my point of view, there's a necessity somehow in saying, oh yes, we should come forward with an EU regulation. And so far, what I hope I have this correctly in mind still, that we are not focusing on AI systems who are already in place. If once the AI Act will be enter into force, then it's the upcoming algorithms what might play a role here. So at the end, I would say, of course, the already existing algorithms and systems, and also if we're coming to search engines or recommendations and something like this, I would say this should be more excluded in a way, because this is more a kind of an easy way forward for the individual in getting some ideas what you might look at video streaming and so on. But this is then not a kind of a high-risk system. It might be different if you're coming to political recommendations, where you can manipulate the individual more. Here, probably it might be necessary to think differently of it. I do not know if this is answering your question at the end.
It is. So, and indeed, I read it the same way as it stands. Of
Yeah.
course, I don't know the final state of the negotiation, but everything that exists already is excluded from it. I do wonder about, let's say, a software that relies on expert systems to some degree. If they put out a new version, whether or not it will be covered by the AI Act and whether or not it should be. But let's look forward and let me discuss new systems to be introduced, and let us here put the attention on unsupervised learning. So where we think indeed that it might be a risk depending, of course, on the sector. So the AI Act imposes, again, as it stands in August 2022, that the data sets to train, validate, and test high-risk AI systems, I quote, shall be relevant, representative, free of errors, and complete. So to start with, I am not sure this is ever possible. There will always be some unequal ground truth, as people call it. So by definition, no data set can correctly represent all the characteristics of different populations. But even if possible, I do wonder what it means in practice. Of course, I understand why we may want to avoid the incorrect handling of training data, where you assign wrong labels to data. But let's say that we are dealing with data that is historically racist or sexist. So how do we correct that? I guess we have to do it, but how do we do it? So my question in short is the following. Can you provide some guidelines for the developers listening to us, and what the fact of training the AI system with a data set that is free of errors and complete will represent for them?
So at first, coming directly to this point of 100% free of errors, This is already, I would say, accepted that this can't be the case at the end. So we are thinking about a different wording where we can say probably this is a kind of a goal as free of errors as possible and so on, but not coming up with a kind of a certain percentage. This is probably not feasible or practical also in a way. But of course, and this is what I consider in your question is behind this, of course, we are coming as a legislator with a whole wish list, what AI algorithms should fulfill and how the result should be and so on. And this is not only this in line with GDPR, explainability, and what you have mentioned, free of errors, etc. Also, this should be non-biased, it should be non-discriminatory, and it should be gender balanced, and so on. And and we might have a long list in mind what algorithms should do. And here we are coming to a kind of a problem when we are starting to combine, let's say, principles, ethical principles, or whatever, to technology. Or let me say it differently, when we are adding values, our values, to technology, we need to have in place a kind of a standardization moment where we are saying, oh, with this standard, you are fulfilling these, so that this is still practical. But we have to focus here also on a different problem, the interlinking with the GDPR. If you all would like to have these error-free results and the non-discriminatory and gender balance and so on, then you need massively a lot also of personal data, what normally the GDPR is not providing. And this is why we have to find a way that we can, if we are asking for such results of algorithms, then we have also to provide the quality data, what is needed for a good result of algorithms. And here we might have a kind of a political problem, and but I think there's no way around. So of course we might have standards at the end, but there might be a solution in these so-called sandboxes, where we are creating an environment for training your algorithms, where you can get a lot of data without asking if this is allowed or not. So this would be a kind of a way forward from my point of view. If there are other ideas, please let us know. But we have to find a way that our European developers have the possibility to develop algorithms in such a way the legislator would like to see it. And here I hope we might be helpful here.
So you mentioned the political problem and GDPR. Of course, you may want to add to the mix the Data Act, Data Governance Act, for certain companies, the DMA, the DSA. So and of course, this is never, I think, in my opinion, a good reason why we shouldn't regulate, because it becomes too complex. I mean, the laws are here for good reasons, but you may want to consider the balance. And I'm very pleased to hear that you do have this concern in mind. Talking about political problems, there is one that is dear to me because I think it is often neglected when it comes to digital law. And I'm here referring to regulatory capture and public choice theory. So here in the AI Act, there is this idea that national supervisory authorities created to ensure the application and implementation of the AI Act should have the technical expertise. And I presume that we all agree this is a good idea. But it means that those authorities will have to hire from the private sector to some degree, and that the personnel with such a very valuable expertise after leaving, the authorities will be on the markets, and of course it's good for them, but what you may want to avoid is the capture of those ex-officials into private firms. So my question is whether or not you think or you plan on creating ethical guidelines, for instance, to prevent leaving members of those authorities for working on cases they have investigated within the agency, or whether or not you have other ideas to prevent what we call pantouflage in France. So this idea that, you may jump from private to public, which to some degree is necessary because the expertise, should be shared. But I also see a risk here. So is it one of your concern? And if so, which direction are you taking to try to prevent or at least slow down those issues?
You're totally right. This is becoming a kind of a practical problem. If we do not have the experts in such a number available, then let's say the certification is probably not possible in a time where you are considering this is a normal procedure. So this is a real problem. Therefore, and this is also one reason I would like to ask also my colleagues here in the House to minimize the AI systems as much as possible, so that they are not underfalling all these safeguards and the obligations for the developer, etc. Because we do not have probably in a proper time experts available who can certify also something like this. So this is an existing problem, and I hope we find a way to circumvent this problem a bit. To evaluate all these, yes, we need these experts, of course, if we are classifying some AI systems as high risk, there should be in place the AI board, what we are asking for also, and what the Commission has also proposed. But then once again, this is more than less a kind of an evaluation and recommendation. But this might be in the first place a point where we might come forward with. In the long run, there is an idea already here on our level where we are thinking probably we should install an AI agency, but also including probably all these supervisions and authorities for DSA, DMA, Digital Governance Act, Data Governance Act, and Data Act probably, and also GDPR, to get a holistic approach on all these evaluations. So where we have competition experts, where we have lawyers, where we have GDPR experts on board, and that they are evaluating in a broader context or broader way forward the situation, because data today, of course, is not only a kind of or aspect of fundamental right, it's also an aspect of wealth, of added value, of future development of competition. And that's why I think we need a broader approach also in evaluating these. This might not happen in this first step, but we have to make sure that experts are on board. And in practical terms, if these experts are not available, we should look for a kind of a different possibility that everyone who is creating something and there's no expert there for, let's say, certifying this, then we should or might find a way that that we have other options in place.
It's very interesting to me that you are already considering, not the lack of expertise, but the ability to attract such experts in such high numbers. It seems to me that when it comes to the DMA, this is something the European Commission didn't do probably soon enough. They first reported that hiring a few employees would be good enough to enforce the DMA, and then 80 employees, and then maybe 200 employees with just some computer scientists. So I think it's good that we have those questions in mind indeed. And I'm very curious to hear what would be the alternatives, but I suppose this is not something to be disclosed right now. I do have one final question. You mentioned GDPR quite a few times, and indeed this was on top of my mind when reading the AI Act. Especially when reading the estimate for the compliance costs. I suspect they may be way higher because expertise is very scarce, and going for an expert that would charge 1K an hour will probably lead to higher compliance costs. But that's a different story. When it comes to GDPR, we know that it has been proportionally costlier for small companies than for big companies. To apply. We do have recent studies, I will put the link in the description to this conversation, that estimate that 1/3 of mobile apps disappeared upon GDPR implementations. And also the firms exposed to the GDPR experienced a 8% decline in profits, and the decline in profits of small companies is almost double the average. All that is coming from Oxford and BER and other universities. So anyway, not here to discuss the numbers, but we get a feeling that indeed for certain companies it had been easier to comply with GDPR. And now my question is whether or not there is the same risk for the AI Act, which of course, as I mentioned, doesn't mean that the AI Act should not be enacted because it will cost companies, to comply. Well, yes, and it should. But I'm sure we all agree that we should strike a balance when it comes to protecting consumers and users and not putting small and medium companies, especially at a disadvantage in favor of the compliance industry that will generate quite some money, advising companies. So why do you think the AI Act is different than GDPR in this very specific regard?
Yes, so at first, I'm very sad to hear that what you have explained, that especially smaller companies can't really fulfill or in a way coming forward with the GDPR. So this, of course, has not been the intention of the GDPR, but I know there is a lot of bureaucracy in it, but sometimes, and especially in Germany, this is the case, where I would say the interpretation of the GDPR by the DPAs is much more than what we have discussed as a legislator. So they are complicating also the situation. And I'm criticizing these, and I still find we need a kind of a modernization or update of the GDPR, but there is no political courage or will to do so right now. So we have to live with the GDPR in the way you're knowing this. But we should avoid, but this depends more than less on my friends from the more left-wing orientated side. We should avoid to come up with a legislation who is similar to the GDPR. The GDPR already give you a kind of a proof that this is too exaggerated, and therefore we should better balance the possibility of developing and enabling instead of just protecting. But if I'm looking once again here to some colleagues in the House, so what the Commission has done is at first they are looking or seeing this as a kind of a product regulation, but the colleagues here in the House, of some of them, are approaching these like a consumer protection law. And this is complicating things and is leading again and again to more bureaucracy than we should have. And also in this dimension, we discussed in the so-called URI committee already if a kind of full harmonization is necessary. I was a little bit shocked when this issue came up. But of course, we need in Europe a full harmonization that our European industry is not fragmenting the market and so on. So that's why I can't predict what will be the outcome. But if you're asking me personally how I would like to have it, of course, with as less as possible on bureaucracy, and that we are more enabling with this idea, let's say, on standards, or with this idea on sandboxes and so on, and how we can mitigate more. Of course, balancing these to our ambition, what an algorithm should do. But here we should more think in practical terms instead of 150% security on everything what we can protect.
Yeah, and you mentioned the fragmentation, and that's in my view, this might be one of the reasons why, to some degree, the US is so far ahead of us, because of course they do have a uniformed market, where in Europe you have to comply with so many different rules. So that's of course one of the very good points of the AI Act, that at least when it comes to those filter systems, they will be constrained by the same rules. I think this is pretty much all I wanted to discuss. I'm wondering if there is anything very important I forgot to ask you.
Just to your last aspect, and this is a very important one. Competition is the key idea what we should have in mind. And here, of course, Europe can provide to the world something what might be unique in saying, oh, we are linking values to technology. And if we are doing so, we need to be as fast as other regions in the world. And if we are not doing this, then probably we are out of the competition. And this, I would consider myself, is not the intention what we should follow.
Yeah, and I would love to see the same when it comes to blockchain. The US have been very active, and President Biden ordered all the federal agencies to come up with a plan to foster blockchain development, and of course constrain the use of it in a way that is good for society. So it's a way to use the law to enable the tech, instead of indeed just using the law to tackle what should be tackled, but without focusing on the big picture, which is one of competition. Being a professor of competition law, I try my best to avoid those issues, but I'm very glad that you brought that to the table. So thank you very much for a lovely conversation. The weeks ahead of us are very exciting, and I'm sure very tiring for you especially. Yeah. So best of luck. And maybe we'll discuss in a few years and see how far we went on those questions. So thank you very much, and have a good day.
Yes, I would love it. And thanks to you, and also for your invitation.